People often ask me where ideas for illustrations come from. Sometimes it's a very specific image that pops into my head, but more often it starts with a question. This piece began because New York Comic Con announced a reunion of the X-Men, Days of Future Past cast in 2025. I thought it would be fun to create a print for the convention. If I was going to spend weeks drawing one large X-Men piece, I wanted it to have an idea behind it. Whenever I draw fan art, I'm usually trying to answer a question rather than simply draw the characters. There are already countless incredible X-Men illustrations. Jim Lee, Art Adams, Alan Davis, the list goes on forever. I don't think I have anything to prove by drawing Wolverine with bigger muscles or adding more explosions in the background, so I started asking myself what the X-Men actually represent, not individually, as a group. That's when I found myself thinking about Raphael's School of Athens. It's one of those paintings I've loved for years, and every time I look at it, I notice something new. The perspective is extraordinary, the architecture is beautiful, but that's never been the reason I keep coming back to it. What I love is the premise. Raphael imagined history's greatest philosophers gathering in the same place, even though many of them never met and some lived centuries apart. It's almost like the greatest crossover event ever imagined. The painting creates a conversation that history never allowed to happen. That struck me because comics do exactly the same thing all the time. We accept impossible situations without questioning them. Characters from different generations meet, heroes from different realities stand side by side. We don't ask whether it could happen, we ask what happens once they're together. The more I thought about it, the more natural the comparison became. The X-Men spend an incredible amount of time talking. That sounds strange for a superhero book, but it's true. They argue about leadership, they argue about ethics, they argue about whether humans and mutants can coexist, they argue about responsibility, revenge, forgiveness, and survival. Every major X-Men story eventually becomes a debate disguised as an action story. Take the fights away, and those conversations are still interesting. That's probably why the X-Men have lasted for so many decades. Every important character has a worldview. Professor Xavier believes one thing, Magneto believes something else entirely. Cyclops slowly develops his own philosophy. Storm has hers. Beast has his. Wolverine certainly has his. They're constantly testing each other's beliefs. At that point, I wasn't really thinking about making a poster anymore. I was wondering whether the X-Men could occupy Raphael's painting naturally, not because it would be a clever reference, because maybe they already belong there. That's a very different way of approaching fan art. I'm never particularly interested in replacing one character with another just because the pose fits. I like adaptations where the original artwork and the new subject almost seem destined for each other, where each one teaches you something about the other. As soon as I committed to the idea, I realized I had created a much harder problem for myself. I couldn't place characters wherever they looked good. Every placement needed a reason. If someone familiar with the School of Athens looked at the drawing, I wanted them to understand why each character occupied that position. If someone had never seen Raphael's painting, I wanted the composition to feel completely natural anyway. That's always my favorite kind of reference. It rewards people who recognize it, but it never depends on recognition. The artwork has to work on its own first. Only then does the second layer become interesting. So before I drew a single line, I spent quite a while just thinking, not sketching, thinking who would stand where, and more importantly, why? Once I knew I wanted to reinterpret the School of Athens, I stopped thinking like an illustrator and started thinking like a casting director. Raphael had already solved one of the hardest problems an artist can solve. He created a composition with dozens of figures, yet your eye immediately knows where to go. Every philosopher occupies exactly the place they need to occupy. Move one person, and the whole painting starts to feel unbalanced. So I wasn't asking, where should Wolverine stand? I was asking, who earned this position? The obvious place to start was the center of the painting. Everything in the school of Athens revolves around Plato and Aristotle. Even if you've never studied philosophy, your eye naturally lands on them because Raphael designed the architecture around that conversation. For me, Professor Xavier immediately felt like Plato. Plato spent much of his philosophy talking about ideals. He believed there was a higher reality beyond the imperfect world we experience every day. Whether or not you agree with him isn't really the point. What matters is that he always looked beyond the present. He was interested in what humanity could become. That feels very close to Xavier. Xavier has always been driven by a vision that doesn't quite exist yet. He sees a future where mutants and humans coexist peacefully. Sometimes that dream feels impossible, sometimes it feels naive, but he never really lets go of it. Even when everything around him suggests he's wrong, he continues moving toward that ideal. Across from him, I placed Beast as Aristotle. I liked that pairing because Beast has always felt like one of the most grounded members of the team. Aristotle believed that understanding begins by observing the world in front of you. Instead of imagining perfect realities, he studied nature, biology, politics, ethics, almost everything. That curiosity immediately reminded me of Beast. He's one of those rare comic book characters whose intelligence actually shapes the way he behaves. Science isn't just something he does, it's the lens through which he understands the world. What I really liked was putting those two characters face to face, not because they're enemies, because they need each other. Vision without evidence can drift into fantasy. Evidence without vision can lose sight of where it's going. Xavier and Beast have always complemented each other in that way. Once those two were in place, the rest of the painting started opening up. Cyclops was surprisingly easy. I chose to place him where Raphael painted Socrates. Socrates was famous for questioning people. He challenged assumptions. He forced people to defend what they believed. That's something Cyclops has gradually become over the years. When Scott first appeared, he was simply the disciplined field leader. But as the decades went on, writers kept putting him into impossible situations where every decision carried a cost. Eventually, he stopped being just the tactical leader of the X-Men and became someone constantly asking difficult questions about leadership itself. Storm came next. She occupies the position of Pythagoras, which might seem like an unusual choice at first. Most people associate Pythagoras with mathematics, but what fascinated me was his belief that the universe possesses an underlying harmony. Mathematics, music, and nature weren't separate things to him. They were different expressions of the same order. Storm has always carried that same sense of balance. She commands incredible power, yet almost never feels consumed by it. She leads with patience instead of force. Even when she's standing in the middle of chaos, she somehow projects calm. She felt like one of the easiest characters to place because that quiet confidence is already part of who she is. At this point, I started realizing something I hadn't expected. The painting wasn't forcing strange comparisons. It was revealing similarities that had probably been there all along. That was probably the moment I knew the idea was going to work. The character I probably spent the longest thinking about was Wolverine. At first I assumed he'd be somewhere near the center. He's arguably the most recognizable X-Man, so the instinct is to give him the most prominent position. But the more I looked at Raphael's painting, the more I realized that prominence wasn't really the point. Every position carries meaning. Eventually, I settled on Heraclitus. Heraclitus believed that change is the fundamental nature of reality. His most famous idea is that you can't step into the same river twice because both you and the river are constantly changing. Whether Wolverine would ever quote Heraclitus is another question entirely. But when I think about Logan's life, change is everywhere. He's lived through wars, countries, generations, identities, and countless losses. Everyone around him grows old and disappears while he keeps moving forward. He's constantly adapting to a world that refuses to stay still. He's also one of the characters who seems least interested in explaining himself. While everyone else debates ideology, Wolverine usually acts first and reflects later. That gave him a very different energy from the more conversational characters surrounding Xavier. Then there was Gambit. I placed him where Raphael painted Diogenes, lying comfortably in the middle of the stairs. Diogenes has always been one of my favorite philosophers because he seemed completely uninterested in society's expectations. He questioned status, wealth, and reputation, often through humor rather than lectures. There's something wonderfully rebellious about him. That felt very Gambit. Even after joining the X-Men, Gambit always carries the feeling that he belongs to himself first. He isn't trying to become the perfect X-Man. He's perfectly comfortable standing slightly outside the group, watching everyone else with that familiar grin. Jean Grey became Alexander the Great. Alexander isn't one of the philosophers, which makes his appearance in Raphael's painting interesting. He's there because ideas don't remain inside classrooms forever. Eventually they shape the world. Jean occupies a similar place in the X-Men. She's one of the characters through whom everyone else's ideals are tested. Her power constantly forces questions about responsibility, restraint, and identity. So much of X-Men history pivots around Jean that placing her among the thinkers felt completely natural. One substitution that probably won't be obvious unless you know the original painting is Kitty Pryde. Raphael quietly painted himself into the school of Athens. He's standing near the edge of the composition, looking directly toward the viewer. I always love that little detail because it reminds you that every work of art contains its creator somewhere, even if they never literally paint themselves. I didn't want to insert myself into the picture. That felt wrong. Instead, I chose Kitty. For a lot of readers, Kitty is the way into the X-Men. She's young, curious, and constantly learning from the people around her. She spends as much time observing as she does speaking. In a way, she becomes our representative inside this gathering of extraordinary people. Once all of those decisions had been made, something unexpected happened. The drawing actually became easier. Usually the difficult part of a large illustration is arranging the characters so the composition feels balanced. Here, Raphael had already done that work 500 years ago. My challenge wasn't inventing a composition, it was understanding why his composition worked so well. I found that surprisingly humbling. Sometimes as artists, we feel pressure to reinvent everything from scratch. Working on this piece reminded me that studying the masters isn't about copying them, it's about borrowing the questions they already solved. Raphael wasn't simply arranging figures on a page, he was choreographing ideas. That's a very different problem, and I realized I was trying to solve exactly the same one. Part 4. The piece ended up having a nice life at New York Comic Con. I was selling prints of it throughout the weekend, and eventually the original ink drawing sold as well. That's always one of my favorite moments at a convention. For a few days, a drawing is part of my everyday life. It's on the drawing table while I'm working, then it moves to the wall behind my table at the convention, and before I know it, someone is carefully carrying it away. I like that transition. It feels like the drawing is beginning a new chapter, somewhere I'll never see. What stayed with me, even more than the sale, were the conversations. Most people didn't recognize the School of Athens immediately, which honestly was exactly what I expected. It's one of those paintings almost everyone has encountered somewhere, but not everyone remembers where it comes from or why it's important. People would stop because they liked the X-Men, We'd chat for a minute, and eventually I'd mention that the composition was inspired by Raphael. Usually I'd pull up the original painting on my phone so we could look at them side by side. That was always my favorite moment. You could almost watch people see the drawing a second time. Their eyes would start moving around the composition differently. They'd notice beasts standing where Aristotle had been, or Professor Xavier occupying the center. They'd realize Kitty had taken Raphael's place inside the painting. From there, the conversation usually took over. People started asking why I made certain choices. Sometimes they agreed immediately. Sometimes they'd pause for a second and think about another possibility. I really enjoyed that because there wasn't one correct answer I was trying to lead them toward. The drawing wasn't meant to be a puzzle with a solution. It was an invitation to think about the characters in a different way. I've always liked artwork that gives you a reason to spend another minute looking at it. The first impression might be the composition. A little later, you notice a relationship between two characters. Then another detail, then another. Each time you look, the image offers you something slightly different. That's how I experienced the School of Athens, and I think that's one of the reasons people are still fascinated by it after more than 500 years. You never feel like you've completely finished looking at it. Working on this piece also reminded me why I enjoy studying older art in the first place. I'm not looking for poses to copy. I'm interested in understanding why certain images continue to resonate across generations. Why does one composition stay in our collective memory while thousands of others quietly disappear? Usually the answer isn't technique alone, it's the idea holding everything together. Raphael wasn't simply arranging a crowd of people inside a beautiful building. Every figure contributes to a larger conversation. Every placement has a purpose. That was the lesson I kept thinking about while drawing this. Composition isn't only about balance, it's about meaning. Where a character stands changes how we think about them. Who they're looking at changes the conversation. Even the distance between two figures can suggest agreement, disagreement, admiration, or tension before anyone has spoken a single word. Those are storytelling tools, whether you're painting philosophers or drawing superheroes. Looking back, I'm grateful that the days of future past reunion gave me the excuse to explore this idea. Without that announcement, I probably never would have connected Raphael's painting with the X-Men. Now, it's difficult for me to look at one without thinking about the other. I think that's probably my favorite kind of inspiration. It doesn't arrive as a complete picture. It begins with two completely unrelated ideas sitting next to each other for a while. Eventually, they start having a conversation, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, a new image appears. By the time I started drawing this piece, it no longer felt like I was inventing something. It felt like I had finally noticed a connection that had been there all along.